Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're looking at a truly remarkable story of resilience, practical engineering, and honestly, the incredible power of human connection. We're breaking down a beautifully crafted narrative from the Musa and Amina series that goes way beyond a simple rescue mission. It's basically a masterclass in how communities respond to sudden, devastating crises. Okay, let's dive into this explainer and see how a shattered desert village manages to find hope and a path forward right in the middle of the rubble. When a storm destroys what took years to build, the strength is not in the walls, it is in the people. I just love that quote. It comes directly from our source material and completely sets the emotional tone for everything we're about to discuss. You know, we so often think of survival and rebuilding in purely physical terms, right? Like bricks, mortar, wood, concrete. But this story totally reframes that. It shows us that the true structural integrity of a place, it actually comes from the bonds between its people. Section 1, The Sandstorm's Aftermath, a Desert Community and Crisis. So to really understand this crisis, we have to look at the inciting incident. Imagine a sudden, absolutely terrifying desert sandstorm, sweeping through a quiet village with staggering force. We meet Abdullah, a man whose home, a house that had proudly stood for 3 entire generations, was completely obliterated by the winds. I mean, the devastation is so absolute, the pieces of his house are literally scattered across the desert for dozens of kilometers. In the wake of this disaster, Abdullah does something that's incredibly difficult for him. He asks for help. He calls up his friend Muhammad, who, as it turns out, is a born builder. When Muhammad and his family arrive, they're just faced with total devastation. But Muhammad spots something vital. The foundation survived. He tells Abdullah that because that foundation is still there, they don't have to start from zero. They can actually restore the original layout. It's such a powerful moment, showing how an expert eye can find a starting point for hope, even in total ruin. All right, moving to Section 2, Engineering a Rescue, Saving Lila the Cat. Just as Muhammad is preparing to sketch out a rough layout based on that surviving foundation, they're completely interrupted by a frantic cry for help. A neighbor's beloved cat, Layla, is trapped underneath a massive heavy concrete slab left behind by the storm. It looks impossibly heavy to lift by hand, and brute force alone is definitely not going to cut it. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Muhammad applies real-world engineering instinct to solve this emotional crisis instead of panicking. He tells his son Musa that it's time to use a basic but incredibly powerful tool of physics, a lever. By using a rigid bar resting on a pivot point, you can move a firmly fixed, heavy load by applying pressure to the opposite end. It's a brilliant example of keeping a cool head and using applied science when time is quite literally of the essence. So let's walk through the exact 3 steps Musa and his father used to pull off this rescue. Step 1. They quickly scoured the rubble to find a long, solid, sturdy beam. Step 2. They established a pivot point right next to the massive slab pinning the cat. Step 3. Musa and his father worked together, pushing down on the far end of the beam at the exact same time. On the count of 3, their combined downward force levered that heavy slab right up into the air. With just enough clearance created by this simple machine, the neighbor was able to call Layla the cat safely out from the rubble. An absolutely beautiful, practical rescue. And that brings us to Section 3, the power of community, the ripple effect of kindness. You see, saving the cat wasn't just a standalone good deed. It triggered a massive ripple effect. Layla's owner is overwhelmed with gratitude, explaining that this cat is literally all she has left. And when she learns that this family traveled all the way from afar to help poor Abdullah restore his completely destroyed home, she realizes she can actually help them right back. She reveals she has untouched building materials sitting in her backyard from a house expansion her late husband had planned. When Abdullah's friends assume she's offering to simply lend them the extra materials, she flat out refuses that word. So the crucial point is the huge difference between lending and giving. Lending implies a transaction, right? Expecting something in return, keeping a ledger of who owes who. But giving represents unconditional neighborly support. She won't lend, she's going to freely give, because in a time of crisis, transactional relationships just aren't enough to rebuild a village. The neighbor literally tells them, not lend, give and cooperate in righteousness and piety, we are neighbors. She recognizes a really profound truth here. This terrible misfortune could have happened to any of them. The storm didn't exactly choose its targets based on who deserved it. Because everyone is equally vulnerable to disaster, the community must hold together unconditionally. Her contribution of these untouched materials is the exact miracle Abdullah's family needed to turn their sketched layout into a physical reality. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Rebuilding Abdullah's Home.
Teamwork in action. Now that they have the materials, it's time for the actual physical reconstruction. The source material highlights that turning a pile of desert rubble back into a functioning home is incredibly hard work. Like one of the characters' jokes, having your house scattered across the desert is not exactly like leaving Legos all over the floor. It takes sheer discipline, muscle memory, and the humility to trust your measurements rather than just trusting your eyes. Let's move to and see how this builds across a rapid timeline of teamwork. Day 1 was all about assessing the damage and sketching the rough layout based on that surviving foundation. Day 2 saw the community coming together, gathering those generously donated materials from the neighbor. By day 3, it was all about discipline, laying bricks, letting their hands remember the work even when their backs were aching, and keeping a strict, fast-paced schedule. And finally, day 4 marks the completion, where they get to celebrate their massive achievement with Abdullah's special tea.
The culmination of all this hard work is this incredibly touching moment where they finally turn to Abdullah and say, "Welcome to your home." He walks in and can barely believe his eyes. I mean, it's almost as if the devastating storm never even happened. The family didn't just build walls and a roof, they paid attention to the deeply personal details. Amina and her mother actually arranged the teacups exactly the way they remembered them from their last visit before the storm. It totally proves that rebuilding isn't just an engineering challenge, it's a profound act of deep love and attention to detail. Now for our final section, the strength of family, care beyond blood. Abdullah is so overwhelmed by this whole rebuilding effort that he realizes a profound truth about the people who showed up for him. He tells them they aren't just friends, they're family. And with that title comes some really playful banter, like the new rule that they can pet the grandfather's head, but definitely not the tail. But on a more serious note, instead of packing up and going back to their comfortable lives, the family looks around at the rest of the devastated village and decides they're going to stay. They're going to help everyone else who was hurt by the storm. And this brilliantly illustrates the core takeaways from our source material. First, real family doesn't end where blood ends. It begins where care begins. Second, true character is showing up to help not because you have to, but simply because it's the right thing to do. Third, enormous crises are solved when communities cooperate and give freely. And finally, as the characters lovingly joke at the end, you don't always need ancient legends, scrolls, or mysterious riddles to do something heroic. Though, they do make a quick exception for the legend of a brave parrot who defeats villains single-handedly. It's a great little moment that keeps the heavy themes wonderfully light and memorable.
Which brings us to our final slide, and a question I really want to leave sitting right at the front of your mind. We've seen how a foundation, a lever, and a generous neighbor can rebuild a whole life. So ask yourself, who in your community needs your help today? You might not need to build a house from scratch, but maybe someone just needs a lever to help lift a heavy burden. Think about it. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.